welcome to the Transforming Trauma Podcast, a complex trauma podcast through the NARM Training Institute. My name is Sarah Bueno, and I'm so excited to be sharing today's interview with you. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. The NARM Training Institute has a very special announcement. We are offering the Level 2 NARM Therapist Training online for the very first time. For anyone who may have been waiting for NARM training to come to your city or country, the wait is over. You can join us online starting in January 2021 for this NARM Therapist Training for mental health professionals working with complex trauma. This online training is an exciting opportunity to receive advanced, specialized training in addressing attachment, relational, developmental, and cultural and intergenerational trauma. For more information and to register, please visit www.narmtraining.com/level2online. We look forward to you joining our growing international NARM community and are inspired to work with you to bring NARM to your clients and communities in order to transform trauma. Hello, Transforming Trauma listeners. We're going to do something a little bit different with today's episode. Some of you may already know about the NARM Inner Circle. The NARM Inner Circle is an online membership program for those who are interested in learning more about the NARM approach for addressing complex trauma. And as an end-of-the-year gift to our loyal Transforming Trauma listeners, we're going to share here on the podcast a special topic webinar from the NARM Inner Circle. And this is a special opportunity to receive in-depth learning from the NARM creator, Dr. Laurence Heller, and senior trainer, Brad Kammer. In this webinar, NARM and Working in the Present Moment, Brad and Dr. Heller explore how NARM uses a phenomenological approach. Oh, that's a mouthful. And that means working in the here and now to resolve patterns of developmental trauma. NARM presents a unique way of addressing unresolved trauma that differs from many other treatments of trauma and revolutionizes our understanding of treating complex PTSD. They'll touch on such areas as how trauma patterns show up in the here and now, working in the present moment with personal history, how to avoid trauma reenactments with the therapeutic process, and spiritual dimensions of the NARM approach in supporting post-traumatic growth. They'll also be introducing several self-reflective exercises to support your own learning process. We invite you to pause the episode and take time to reflect during those exercises if you wish. We hope you enjoyed this end-of-the-year gift, and thanks again so much for your listenership in this, our first year of Transforming Trauma.
All right, well, welcome everyone to our Inner Circle webinar on NARM and Working in the Present Moment. Really excited, been looking forward to this one because I think it's one of the unique features of NARM that we really work with these patterns of adaptation to trauma in the present moment, as opposed to going back and trying to address the trauma as it happened in the past, which we also have to remember the context of the trauma field, that up until very recently, that really the way of working with trauma was going into the past. And even still, there's a lot of models that are still addressing it like this. So again, I think that we'll be getting into the meat of why it's so important from a NARM perspective to be working in the present moment. Before we get started, anything you wanted to say, Larry?
No, you pretty much said it, but I'll go into the details of why we don't ignore the past and what happened in the past. But the reasons why it's so important to not make it just about the past and how that relates to clinical application is where at least one of the important focuses for today.
So as you know, those of you that have been part of this for the last couple of years, we like to start with a reflective exercise. It's a way of engaging us more experientially, more embodied into the material we're about to dive into. So we're going to invite you, it's up to you whether or how you want to do these exercises, but if you're open to it, we're going to invite you to take a few moments to reflect on clients or situations where you find yourself having difficulty staying in the present moment. So clients or situations where you find yourself having difficulty staying in the present moment.
Let me maybe give a couple of examples. So it could be you're making your grocery list. It could be that you're having difficulty staying awake. It could be you find yourself daydreaming. Many other possibilities, but just to give you some ways that therapists struggle to be in the present moment.
Yeah. And as you reflect on this and think of these experiences, we'll give you some time just to notice your internal experience. You might even find yourself now doing this exercise having trouble staying in the present moment, and that's okay. Just that could be part of the exercise, just taking some time to notice that. Okay, so we're going to transition to starting to get into this topic more from kind of a theoretical place here, and then we'll move into the application perspective a little bit later. So let's start from the beginning here, Larry. Why is NARM a model that emphasizes working in the present moment? Why is that important when working with developmental and complex trauma?
One of the reasons that we emphasize it is that so much of the adaptation to early trauma is to disconnect, and to disconnect from the body, to disconnect from emotions, and to disconnect from the present moment, which could mean dissociating or could mean just going into the head and ruminating, compulsively thinking. So we teach people to track that moment by moment connection and disconnection process that clients and we all experience, not trying to get people into the present moment, but trusting that as awareness of these dynamics gets stronger and more effective, that the natural state of human beings is to be in the present moment. And consistent with the four pillars, we're exploring what's getting in the way of that in terms of the various adaptations to usually to early trauma that people have made.
So maybe you could just do a little bit more clarification about when you talk about connection, disconnection, just giving us a little bit of a reminder of that.
Well, it relates to the somatic element in NARM. And even though I put NARM clearly in the somatic psychotherapy, at least one of the influences has been somatic psychotherapy, we work with the body differently. But when you think about it, the body only exists in the present moment. In our mind, we can be ruminating about the past and we can be worrying about the future and all of these dynamics. And it's very consistent and ancient, particularly ancient Eastern traditions of the eternal now, which is the present moment. And the access to that is through the body. And so we pay very close attention to when people are tensing and or collapsing, because that represents a kind of a disconnection. And that's a communication that we want to understand what's going on and help reflect that to the client so that they can build that into their increasing mindfulness and self-awareness capacity.
So it kind of works in both directions, that as people have more awareness, they have more capacity to be in the present moment. And as they're more in the present moment, they have more capacity to have awareness about the connection, disconnection process.
Yeah, it's a virtuous cycle that gets going. Exactly.
So I think we already started talking about this, the moment-to-moment tracking of the client's experience by the therapist. So this is a little bit more of the clinical, how we're helping, we ourselves as therapists, NARM therapists, are helping track the moment-to-moment connection, disconnection process, but we're also helping our clients. So could you talk more from this perspective of working in the present moment?
Sure. So as I mentioned a moment ago, the two primary ways that we disconnect are through tension and collapse, and the various elements that are associated with that. So for example, we track a person's breathing. We don't do deep breathing exercises in NARM, as I think probably most people out there know, because we don't try to change people's state by imposing shifts on the organism. We trust the organism as we work with the obstacles that are in the way of being in the present moment, that the person naturally gets more present. So we don't use breathing exercises, but we pay attention to the breath. We pay attention to where people tense and collapse. We can watch, when people are tensing their jaw or grinding their teeth. These are all mechanisms of disconnection, as are all of the patterns of tension and collapse that we experience ourselves and that we can see in our clients and in the world in general. And the interesting thing too is that these tension and collapse patterns become chronic, and so that we're all living with some degree of disconnection at any given moment. Now, different degrees, and the only way that they can they can change through some help with body work and other kinds of techniques, but really mindfulness, a certain kind of somatic mindfulness and a certain kind of self-awareness, and looking at what is frightening about being present to ourselves and other people. Those dynamics help us get increasingly present, increasingly in the present moment.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there. Well, let me ask you more generally, what's the relationship between tension and collapse and dissociation?
For example, when we're in a scary moment in a movie, and then whoever is, the protagonist or whatever, as they get out of danger, many people will find themselves, they'll start to breathe, because holding the breath is a way of disconnecting from emotions and a way of disconnecting from our body. And that's primarily, though, that we're disconnecting from emotions when we're dealing with emotional trauma, developmental trauma, complex trauma, the different names that are now being used.
So dissociation has a somatic platform.
It's a somatic dynamic where we increasingly disconnect from the body. I mean, all these structural kinds of models of dissociation, I'm not saying there's not some value in them, but they make it too complex. It's basically when we dissociate, we're disconnecting in a variety of ways from the body. Now we can do that by a dimmer switch dynamic where we dim down all of our physical and emotional feelings. We can do it like a breaker switch phenomenon where everything just shuts off. Happens, when there's been significant developmental trauma or significant shock trauma. These are mechanisms, and we've talked about dissociation in other webinars, but there's a whole spectrum of dissociative responses, and they can all be tracked back to the body. That's the interesting thing, and they're all a disconnection from the present moment. We're living someplace else. We're not really there. We're projecting, we're imagining, we're fantasizing, we're speculating, all of the things that we as human beings tend to do.
Yeah. This then leads me to this question. I'm sure a lot of therapists will relate to this, where you're talking with the client, and now clients have been so therapized that they have all this language or jargon. So they'll say, oh, I'm dissociated. Mm-hmm. So can you talk about in NARM how we might hold that and how we might work with that?
If a client is telling us that they're dissociated, then I might ask them, how is it that you know that right now? And I also might point out to the fact that if they're aware of dissociating, they're not completely dissociated. Because the tricky thing about dissociation, as many people have experienced with themselves and with others, is that often we don't know. That's the plus and the minus of dissociation. We don't know that we're dissociating until we come out of it. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, it's like we wake up and this bubble breaks and we're like, oh, where have I been? And we, there are simple examples of that. Like we do that when we're driving sometimes, and we don't remember how we got from place A to place B. That's a kind of a dissociative process. But mostly we're talking about more emotionally driven dynamics where people disconnect from themselves, the present moment, and the body and their emotions.
So one part of it would be to ask them, how they know that, but another part would be to reflect on what might have been triggering them of what you were reflecting on before they then said that they were dissociated.
Absolutely. So like if a person, and sometimes of course we have to let them know, we might reflect, I'm wondering if you're going away right now, because we can track, as people disconnect. And so then we start to then do what we call the deconstruction of experience. We back it up a little bit, and we want to know what was going on before they started to go away. And we slow that process down and stretch it out so that they can bring, and we in the Therapeutic Alliance can together explore what were the dynamics that were going on that felt threatening to the person, that they felt the need to start taking themselves away. Yeah. And so that's a very important piece of working in the present moment with the dissociative process and how dissociation takes us out of the present moment.
Feels very important. You said something I think would be really useful to repeat for us. And I tried to write it down, but you said it pretty quickly. We don't change people's states by imposing shifts. We work with the obstacles that are in the way of them being connected to those states or something like that. So right. Could you just kind of talk a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, in other words, many therapeutic models will you traditionally at least have used deep breathing exercises or progressive relaxation exercises. And for some people, those things can be fine to a certain point, depending on their psychobiological capacity. But overall, and particularly for the more early traumatized individuals, to impose changes of state from the outside can override the inbuilt protective mechanisms that they've developed. And we don't want to do that. those protective mechanisms are what we want to explore. The so-called resistance in some traditional models is exactly where the important information is. Those are the obstacles that get in the way. Those are the learned obstacles. These are the ways that people have adapted to threat and difficulty and challenges, various and different ways of disconnecting from themselves and from others.
And you say that the quote unquote resistance, those obstacles are the important things to explore because?
Well, because that's what's keeping them out of the present moment. And that's why, for example, NARM can be integrated with a number of different models, but it can't be integrated with others. So, for example, NARM and hypnotherapy don't integrate well because they're two different models of the human experience. And hypnotherapy uses a bypass mechanism to get to various kinds of material. And that's just kind of the opposite of what we're doing. It's not what happened, but the adaptations to what happened, which is what you alluded to in the beginning, that create the symptoms that human beings experience.
Yeah, I think maybe we should slow down for a moment because I feel like that's such a critical piece about, it puts a few pieces together about why we don't do all these we don't do resourcing. We're not doing certain kind of exercises in NARM that we're really exploring the obstacles, the strategies that people have developed as part of their early adaptations to failure in their environment, failure in their attachment.
Right. We, for example, if somebody goes, like they're talking, they go like that, we will bring attention to that. But what we don't do, which is different from some other models, is that we don't initiate that. We don't say, well, let's see what happens if you start pushing against a pillow. That would not be a NARM intervention because, again, it's imposing change. In NARM, there's this profound trust and in the spontaneous movement towards health that hopefully everybody at this point has read. It's on the book, it's in our teaching, it's in all of the trainings. It's usually the first thing that I put up on the screen for people to look at, because this spontaneous movement towards health there's a part of us that's trying all the time to reconnect. And that impulse is what we're using, and then it's just our job to explore what are the learned obstacles that are in the way of that reconnection to being fully, or as fully as possible, present in the present moment.
I don't know about anyone else. I could stop the webinar right here because I feel like you've said such a rich, this has brought NARM together in such a simple but also very complex, comprehensive way about the present, working in the present moment, and why NARM sets up the organizing principles that we do that are exploratory based, inquiry based, and not trying to impose change, not trying to get somewhere, not trying to be goal oriented.
I don't know if I'm anticipating a later slide or not, but I can say a little bit more about the different orientation to the past. Because you see, the past is past. We don't talk about in NARM that people are stuck in the past, because it's just not true. They're not stuck in the past. The bridge between the past and the present are the adaptations that people have made. Those are present, and they're carrying those forward. Now, of course, and we see this again and again in NARM sessions, that as we work in the present moment with the disconnection, and as people start to reconnect, then spontaneously elements from unmetabolized, unworked through elements from people's past and their personal history emerge spontaneously in the therapeutic session. I'm hoping everybody has seen sessions where that happens, because it's really, in a way, as many times as I've seen it, it's kind of magical. It's like what was unmetabolized tends to surface organically and spontaneously when we're working in the present moment. So it isn't to say, of course, therapies that have focused on the past have been helpful to many people, but I don't think they fully understood the mechanism and what was helpful. Some people could make that bridge themselves. More integrated people were able to, they could see this, this thing happen, this experience or set of experiences when we're talking about developmental trauma I experienced that, I didn't realize that was connected to and so they're making the connection on a cognitive level, but because they're integrated, it's also affecting them emotionally and somatically. So of course, I'm not saying that NARM is the only therapy that's ever helped people, but I think we've refined the understanding of what it is specifically that is helpful. And that has to do with this present moment piece.
Yeah. All right. So NARM differentiates between anxiety and fear. And how does that relate to working in the present moment?
Well, it's part of our bigger model of emotions, but we make the distinction between anxiety and fear. Fear is a healthy response to an actual threat, and it mobilizes us to fight or flee. So that's a real emotion. Then it has a somatic interface and all of that, and then we initiate some kind of action either to fight or to flee. But anxiety is in NARM is not considered emotion, it's considered a signal. And that's usually a signal that we might use the word unconscious, or material that has been out of people's awareness is starting to come to consciousness. And it signals the presence often of frightening emotions, could be frightening memories, could be other things, and the emotions that go with them. But they're very different dynamics. And one is emotion, fear. The other, again, is in another category, what we call a signal response.
And in terms of, working in the here and now, working in the present moment, so are you saying that most things that would come up like in a therapy session would actually be expressions of anxiety as opposed to fear, unless there was some real threat that was happening in that immediate environment?
Exactly. Yeah. So mostly what we deal with in the therapeutic session, as you're saying, is anxiety. And even remembered fears are, when we're experiencing them in the therapeutic session, they're coming up as anxiety. And we want to know, what is it that the person is really anxious about? And what is it that's starting to surface? Often we've seen, and this is a technique that we use that's very helpful for people with chronic anxiety, is that often they're really afraid of anger, their own anger. And that's a question that I will sometimes ask clients when they've had, years of anxiety, for example. I'll ask them, I'm curious about your relationship to anger. And very anxious people will tend to have a very common response, which is anger. What anger? I don't experience anger. I'm afraid of it when other people are angry, or I'm around angry people. That scares me. But I don't experience that much anger. And so we start to see, and then we explore, okay, well, what's that about? And we continue the exploration process. And we see then what it is about anger that eventually, again, with tact and timing, but we get to eventually what it is about anger that is so frightening. And as you and I have seen, Brad, pretty consistently, is that so often the fear of the anger has to do ultimately with the fear of the loss of the attachment relationship and the whole anger protest dynamic that we teach when we're teaching NARM.
You kind of just ran through this, but I was going to ask you for an example. Like, let's say someone comes to you and says they want you to help them work through their fear of going to talk to their boss about a raise or something. And every time they think about going to talk to their boss, they get panic and, they can't even, get to the door. And they're looking at this as a fear response, right. And that's how they're bringing it up. And they talk about going into freeze and all this stuff. So how in NARM might you start to approach that client, working with that client?
Well, first, I wouldn't put it completely in the category of anxiety, because it might also be that there is fear, and because they are picking up something. So I don't want to ever automatically assume that it's just anxiety, that it's just issues from the past, because there you're talking about a real life situation that could have economic impact, and we don't want to dismiss that in NARM. But at the same time, we're also assuming that some of this is most likely anxiety. Now, a less loaded kind of example would be this, what people call fear of public speaking, which is really anxiety about public speaking. And all kinds of anxieties come up about public speaking that then we can deal with mostly as their issue, particularly if It's just pride and shame and other issues that are riding on whatever it is that they're presenting publicly. I hope that isn't confusing to people, but sorting all these distinctions out here.
You already talked a little bit about this, but anything more you'd like to say in terms of the role of the body in working with the present moment?
Well, as people, and this works both ways, as people get into the present moment, they're more in their bodies. As they're more in their bodies, they're more in the present moment. Because, as I said earlier, the body only exists in the present moment. And we find that literally the mind quiets over time, and there's less perseveration and all the kinds of dynamics that anxious people tend to do, and increasing embodiment. And that's so important. It leads ultimately to what we call the embodied adult consciousness in NARM, where you're really present and there's an adult perspective and you're very much in your body here in the present moment.
How about things like flashbacks, or, where people are having somatic experiences based on something that did happen in the past?
Well, they're happening in the present. There obviously something is being triggered. So of course we know that flashbacks happen and people get triggered. And then we just start working with what is it that's triggering these flashbacks? What's unfinished for them, particularly on an emotional level, that is emerging in the flashback? And then ultimately, as we do in NARM, we relate it to what are the identifications too that the person developed out of this difficult experience or this series of difficult experiences that they've had. And so as those identifications get clear and dissolve, that as the result of the emotional work that we do, which is always with the orientation towards emotional completion, flashbacks diminish and then generally ultimately go away.
Yeah. You mentioned this, but you didn't really go so much into it. But how do you work in NARM in the present moment with personal history?
Well, again, sometimes people will come in and there's a piece of personal history that they need to deal with. We'll still deal with it as if it were happening right now, generally. It's not it's not a hard and fast rule, but they're really telling us that there's something very unresolved for them that they experienced at some point in their life. And we never would ignore that, because that's where the client is wanting to go and needing to go. But we would still, as we do with any kind of trigger, we talk about it more in the present tense, as if it was happening right now. And the point, you see, what we're really avoiding in NARM is regression, abreaction, and the possibility of catharsis, because those are not, people come in, every single one of us is to one degree or another regressed. We've all got elements of, regressed parts of ourselves, let's say. So we don't want to reinforce that in NARM. Sometimes you see abreaction and catharsis made the history even more real. So instead of making the past, it makes the past more present.
Yeah.
And I work with people who have been damaged by some of these kinds of very regressive approaches. So when we're dealing with these unresolved issues from the history, we're always working with at least 1 foot in the present moment. And so that we're not reinforcing whatever the patterns were that developed in the past.
Yeah. Yeah. Larry and Dick Schwartz, the creator of IFS, did an interview for our podcast. You had this great conversation between the two of you where Dick mentioned an article that I had read a few years back that I quote all the time about the incredible dropout rate of people that are doing exposure therapy, and even more tragically, the suicide rate of people that for vets and stuff, when they're having to revisit these, like you said, it brings it more into the present. And so instead of them feeling like they're getting distance from it, which is what people in NARM always are reflecting, that they feel like something's lifted away from them, for them, it's getting more into the present. They're having more difficulty regulating that. Mm-hmm. And it was cool that you guys got to that, because that is the gold standard in current psychotherapy. I mean, I think exposure therapy is number 2 in terms of the most widely used models for trauma in the United States after CBT, or at least according to the government and stuff. So,
and that fits with my experience, and it's often used with the people who are the most traumatized, which is just the opposite of what's, from my perspective at least, from what's needed.
Yeah. There was a good question that goes back about how in NARM do we ensure that flashbacks and the somatic and emotional reactions to it aren't re-traumatizing if we're not actively regulating fight or flight?
Well, there are all kinds of prodromal reactions that we can see. And when we ignore them, that's when very intrusive imagery will tend to happen. So that we watch, that's why that moment by moment tracking, we can watch people going into either very high arousal states or collapse states. And we work with that dynamic in the moment as it's happening before they get to the place where they start to get all this intrusive imagery. Now, each client is different. So any specific client, we might need to do some other kinds of interventions. But as implied in the question, we're not actively trying to regulate the client. We trust that as they work through their emotional conflicts, regulation happens. And that's what we see all the time.
I tell this story a lot in my teaching, so some people have probably already heard this, but it was I was assisting in one of Larry's classes. I don't know if you've heard this story though, Larry, or maybe you did years ago, but there was a group and there was a lot of somatic practitioners in the group, people that already had a lot of training in somatic. And we were doing these practice dyads and the client was feeling very activated. That's what she was reporting, feeling very activated. And the therapist who had touch background suggested or she asked, would it be okay if I come and just do a little gentle touch on your shoulders? And the client said yes. And then the client clearly relaxed. And during the debrief, one of the observers asked the client how that was to have that regulation from the therapist. And she said, actually, I didn't like it. And she said there was two issues that came up for me. One is I didn't want to say no to the therapist. I was taking care of the therapist because I felt like I was actually okay with the activation, but the therapist clearly wasn't. And the second piece was she felt like there was a bypass that happened, that she felt like there was something really important happening around her anger that was activating for her, and that she ended up regulating away from it as opposed to really being able to learn how to be with it in a different way. And she was actually quite, I wouldn't say upset, but she was a little bit like, I missed an opportunity to relate to this differently. So I always kept that in my mind because it's a really nice distinction of a real lived experience when you're moved away from your experience, even when it is activating, because emotions are activating, or they can be.
One of the things that we implicitly communicate to our clients is that you don't have to run away from yourselves and you don't have to run away from your emotions. And by trying to regulate our clients, I've seen too often that the regulation is just exactly, going along with the story that you mentioned. It implies a lack of confidence in the person's ability to deal with challenging emotions. And we want to support the developing confidence that people have, that they don't have to keep disconnecting from their bodies and their emotions and the present moment, because the worst is already over. They've already, whatever this is, it's already over, and often happened to them when they were younger and had much less internal capacity to deal with it. And as adults, we trust that they tend to have the capacity to deal with whatever difficult emotions may be surfacing.
And again, we don't use this language so much in NARM, but it feels like a corrective experience, because so much of when the therapist is holding, as soon as they feel distress coming from the client, they pull out a skill or some kind of technique. And, I just think of this corrective experience of early attachment where for children, those of us that had kids that had colic, we just held the baby and walked all night for 4 or 5, 6 hours in the middle of the night. And there wasn't anything we could quote unquote do to shift the state of the child. We just were present with them and patient and supportive and a certain kind of loving. And I think that the communication of the parent to the child is a similar communication that we as NARM therapists are providing for our clients. There's a certain kind of trust that's implicit in our being present in the moment with them, even when they are feeling this activation.
And it's an interesting point too, is that trust is communicated to the clients. And so that's not something that we as therapists can fake. But when we have done our own personal work and we have that confidence, and we know that by definition, all emotions are time limited. They only go on indefinitely when we fight against them and resist them. that implicit trust that they can deal with these difficult emotions gets communicated. And so they're, in a certain sense, they borrow that from us and then make it their own.
So you've mentioned this in previous classes. I don't think today you did, but you've talked about parallel processes in NARM. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it has to do with the fact that whatever unresolved dynamics tend to occur, let's say they're talking about something that happened to them, but it's actually going on in the therapeutic process itself. And so we can deal with the here and now, or we can focus on what happened. But it's useful for therapists to be aware of the connection, that these parallel process dynamics are happening all the time in therapy. And for us to be aware of that it just seems to be the way things work, that what's unresolved from the past and from their survival styles, whatever, is also then being expressed in the therapeutic relationship or in some elements that are going on in the here and now in the therapeutic process.
So you mean actually like calling it out in a certain way in therapy, like working with the reenactments, so to speak?
By addressing it in a variety of ways. And then so often the client will make the connection, but sometimes we'll help the clients see the connection. We might say in the NARM kind of way that we do in asking questions, I'm wondering if you're seeing any connection between what you were talking about, in terms of your relationship with your father and what is you're experiencing in the therapy process today. So that particular way of working is certainly not unique to NARM. They made use of that in psychoanalytic and psychodynamic work, but I think we've taken it to a different level in NARM in the way that we integrate that into the work and helping therapists learn how to see that these parallel processes are going on all the time.
For me, that's when NARM comes alive, or when therapy comes alive, is when it's happening real time. So instead of someone have to go back to talk about an experience that they had where they weren't feeling peace and they were feeling really agitated, and when it comes alive in the moment is when we can really work with the dynamics and the patterns. I find that to be that's why I like working with couples, even though it's challenging, because it's like happening right in this moment. It's not right that we're talking about it, but it's happening in the moment, so we can really work with the reactions as they're happening.
Well, and the real difficult unresolved dynamics from the past do come up in the present moment, because we talk about the child's need to protect the attachment relationship, but people don't often experience that as adults. They're not consciously aware that that's at the root of things. What they think is that if I express my needs, I'll be rejected. Or if I say no, nobody will like me. And so from a NARM perspective anyway, that's trying to protect the attachment relationship, but it's the attachment relationship as it's being projected onto the relationship in the here and now. It's much more powerful. They might even develop the capacity to set better limits with their parents, if the parents are still alive, but they have difficulty with other people that are more direct relationships in their life right now. And that's why, again, you mentioned couples therapy. That's why relationships are such a challenge, because anything that's resolved in us will tend to come up in our relationship in a very alive and sometimes acute kind of way.
There's a question going back to the previous slide that you mentioned something about running away from emotions, and that we shouldn't support people running away from them. Because in NARM, we talk about the differentiation between primary and default emotions.
Right.
And I think it would be useful, we can't go into depth into it, but just giving a little bit of, like, you're talking about not running away from primary emotions.
I'm talking about not running away from primary emotions. And also, we never push people into emotions. I want to be clear about that. So we're, unlike some, like ISTDP, for example, we're never trying to push people into emotions. That's why there's so much respect for the so-called defenses, what we call protective mechanisms in NARM, that we help people be aware that they're running away without any intention to try and get them into whatever it is that they're trying to get away from. And that's a seemingly subtle distinction for therapists to get at first. I think after the first module or two, that gets pretty clear. But it is a paradigm shift, I think, for most therapists.
Yeah, and for those of you that are newer to the Inner Circle, we did a previous webinar on differentiating primary and default emotions. So that would be something to visit. And also as part of your membership in the Inner Circle, you get an ebook that really goes deep into the NARM emotional completion model is what we call it, but really talks about the different ways that NARM holds emotions and how we work with emotional completion. So we haven't talked about this yet, and this is an important piece, is how does separation individuation, and you might want to define that too, Larry, how does that relate to working in the present moment?
Well, originally separation individuation was used primarily to describe the process of what Margaret Muller called the psychological birth of human beings, and that the separation individuation process from the actual parents when they're little, and then the unresolved issues of separation individuation that people have carried with them. That's NARM languaging, not Margaret Muller's, but that people have carried with them into adulthood. So in NARM, we do support, and are consistent with that original model that Margaret Muller developed, although I don't worry about the sub-phases of separation individuation like she did. But ultimately, we're holding the possibility that people can separate and individuate from all of their old identifications, or most, particularly the dysfunctional identifications, the self-hatred, the sense of being defective, the sense of being not enough, the sense of being unlovable, the sense of not having a right to have a place in the world and not having a right to stand up and speak authentically to other people. All of those difficulties that we're supporting the capacity to separate from all of that, which is really, from a child's perspective, the separation individuation process, it's something that's natural and spontaneous, but when it didn't take place effectively, when adults work with it, it can often be frightening. But as soon as they turn the corner on that, it feels like such freedom, that they're being free, they're freeing themselves from all of these old identifications, which again, for those of you who are newer, those are not just mental constructs in NARM, they're psychobiological constructs. Every identification is held in the body in a particular way, in tension and collapse, like I mentioned earlier. So we're supporting, by coming increasingly into the present moment, we're separating and individuating from what was traditionally called the past and becoming more and more present. In other words, seeing the world through increasingly more objective lenses, not through the distortions of all of the old adaptations that we made to survive.
That brings us back to what you said earlier about embodied adult consciousness, that we see the world more as it is, as opposed to how we had to view it through the filters of our adapting to trauma.
And the parallel process with that is the more that we see the world as it is, we're also at the same time seeing ourselves more and more as adults, and we don't have the same vulnerabilities as adults that we did as children. As children, we were 100, at the beginning in particular, we were 100% dependent upon the environmental reaction. As adults, many of us have carried those dynamics forward almost 100% at the beginning of the therapeutic process, but we become increasingly less dependent on the emotional reaction for our sense of self, for our sense of value, for our sense of worth, all of these dynamics. So it really is a process of liberation from the past. I always have to do this quotes because I don't, it's different than the way we actually language it in NARM, but I know that that's how many methods have talked about it.
Yeah, another way I hold it and talk about it is it's moving from object to subject, because identifications are by definition objectification of the self and others. And so as we move into our more embodied adult consciousness, we become more subject as opposed to object, which goes back to why it's important to work in the present moment, the phenomenological perspective of really understanding how our clients are organizing their inner experience, because that subjectifies them. It moves them away from object into subject.
Yeah, the paradox is that the more that we become increasingly objective and increasingly subjective, the more that we work on these old dynamics. So they come together.
Yeah. So you've pretty much talked about projection. I don't think you use that word yet, but you want to say anything more about projection and how that works with the present moment?
Well, a very simple way of looking at it is that when we're projecting, we're living in a fantasy. Even, for example, the very everyday projections that go on with when we're transferring Let's say we're transferring a parent or a combination of parents, the imago of parents, on to our partner or our workmate or our boss or whoever, is that we're living in a fantasy. We're not actually seeing them. We're seeing some kind of fantasy about them that we've drawn information from previous experience to create that fantasy. And projection is a psychobiological process, and it has to do with tensing, particularly around the eyes, but in other areas of the body, so that we're, what I've talked about in other webinars as the eye block, as it was described in earlier Reichian therapy, is like every therapist has seen clients as they start to dissociate and get more and more anxious that they're losing contact. They're not here in the present moment. They're into projection, dissociation, and all of these dynamics are happening in the present and as a result of some kind of fantasy. They're going into some remembered fear, which is in NARM terms anxiety, but it's not, there's no danger actually in the present moment. And many therapists have worked effectively with that by just getting the client, and they may say, well, look at me. So as soon as you engage the eyes, you see, then a person, some people at least, will start to come back to the present moment, and the fearful or anxiety-filled fantasies then diminish.
Not exactly what we do in NARM, but that's other models will
right,
do.
That's other models, exactly. Yeah. Although we might just invite somebody to actually look at something.
Yeah.
Because it does interrupt that process. So that would be something that we might do in NARM, because as soon as the person engages the eyes, then things start to change. And we see that in our training groups so often. How many workings, Brad, have you done and have I done, where the person comes up and at first they say, oh, I'm in front of all these people and I'm okay as long as I don't look at them. And it's scary to be up front here in the microphone and all of this. And as we do work on whatever theme they came up to work on, then they start to come out of the projections, and then they'll start to, on their own, start to orient to the group, and they'll start looking and making eye contact. So it's related to the exploratory orienting response that some people have learned in other models. It includes that, but it's more than that. It also deals with the psychological piece of projection here. They're no longer projecting the judgment and ridicule and all of the things that people tend to project when they get up in front of a group.
Okay, getting into the clinical process, how does therapists efforting and caretaking take them out of the present moment?
So often you see when therapists are compulsively efforting and compulsively caretaking, they're engaged in their own, was traditionally called enactment, and these days it's called more reenactment, but they're acting out some of their old identifications and survival style mechanisms, because so many therapists are very responsible people, so that's not a bad thing, but that turns in, they have this idea that things will only happen if you effort. And also many therapists learned to be caretakers at very early ages, and they're reenacting that dynamic with their clients, and it gets in the way of us being present and being curious and really being with and engaged with our clients.
So we got one last slide here. And I bookmarked earlier in the webinar, you made this comment about Eastern traditions having something called the eternal now.
Right.
And, I don't think in 5 minutes we can go so far into the spiritual aspect of working in the present moment. But if you could just give us a little teaser, because we will be covering this in other webinars, and those of you that come into our trainings, you'll be getting more of this. But can you give us a little bit of teaser around this spiritual element?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the eternal now, which is so much a part of many different Eastern traditions, that everything else is fantasy. And in a way, that's very consistent with how we hold it with NARM. And the only thing that is actually real, the only thing that we can really know is right here, right now. Everything else is in some way either speculation or memory, but it's not a real memory, because memory is not accurate. It's distorted memories that we have from the past. And so ultimately it supports a certain kind of flow as people come out of fantasy and into their bodies and into the present moment. There is a kind of a flow and coming back to the heart and feeling connected and feeling expansion and all of these elements that so many of our clients report and that we see when we do workings in the group and in our groups, in our training groups. So there is what many people would consider and recognize as a spiritual aspect to some of the deeper underpinnings of NARM. Interesting enough, too, it was something that Dick Schwartz and I agreed on. There were other things, a number of things that we did have in common, that some of which surprised me, but I don't think he would disagree with that last statement, that's kind of built into his work as well.
Yeah, and again, I think it's important to hold historical understanding because, I mean, we're in a different time and era in 2020. But I mean, up until 20 years ago, talking about spirituality and psychology would have got you completely pushed to the fringe. I mean, we've come a long way to have...
I was there.
You were there, that's right.
Yeah.
I just think that the way we bring it, I mean, I'm very biased, of course, but the way we bring it and have integrated into NARM through the heart and heartfulness. I mean, Larry and I have been doing a lot of these online trainings in the last 3 months or so. And it's amazing how quickly the heart connection shows up even on Zoom in these groups. And it's just something so wonderful because you can look at early trauma as a heartbreak, as a disconnection from our own hearts. And so as we're supported to reconnect to ourselves, there's a reconnection to our heart, and that allows us to connect with other people through our hearts. And for me, that's real embodied spirituality. And that's what I gravitate to. I don't gravitate so much to the other stuff. I gravitate to when it really feels like there's increased connection. And I love that NARM has that built in.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last reflective exercise as we wrap this up is we're going to invite you, if you're open to this, to take a few moments to reflect on a time when you felt yourself particularly present. And as you reflect on this, just to spend some time noticing your internal experience. We're going to invite you to transition back to our group. So just want to thank you, Larry, very much for continuing to guide us and provide mentorship for all of us that are working in NARM and working in this field of complex trauma.
And thank you, Brad, too, for all the great collaboration that we have here. I enjoy so much.
Me too. Yeah. And thank you to all of you for doing the great work that you're doing. We need it more than ever in the world right now. So appreciate that. And this becomes our kind of home base to deepen and, reintegrate in NARM, and then we can go back out into the world a little bit more recharged, hopefully. So take care, everyone.
If you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to check out the NARM Inner Circle, where we host NARM topic webinars like this one every month. Some topics that we cover are differentiating shock and developmental trauma, working with shame, self-hatred, and self-sabotage, complex trauma and addictions, relational trauma, intimacy, and sexuality, addressing burnout and the helping professional, and the NARM approach for supporting personal and spiritual growth. To learn more about the Inner Circle and sign up for a free 2-week trial, please visit www.narmtraining.com/free trial. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. If you want to learn more, you can check out the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. The NARM Training Institute has a very special announcement. We are offering the Level 2 NARM Therapist Training online for the very first time. The trauma field is evolving so quickly. Trauma-informed therapists who want to learn how to address the long-term impacts of adverse childhood experiences and complex post-traumatic stress disorder want to be trained in NARM, one of the first clinical models specifically designed to address ACEs and C-PTSD. This online NARM therapist training is starting in January 2021 and is filling up fast. So if you're interested, we'd encourage you to register now to reserve your spot. Please visit www.narmtraining.com/level2online. That's www.narm-training.com/level2online. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We really look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.